Okay, hi, I'm Joshua Hartshorn. Welcome back to officially week 4, although we took a couple weeks break for CogSci and some other things. Week 4 of Moving Research Online. And so as you probably saw from the emails, what we're planning on doing is I'm going to give a sort of background and context to Pushkin. And then we will have time for people to independently go through the tutorials, which are online, while we will be available to answer questions either on the forum, the Pushkin support forum, or if needed, we have several people here who can hop on Zoom calls with folks talking through stuff. The reason we're going to do it that way is there's a lot of steps here that are going to take varying amounts of time for different people. So if you're trying to follow along as I walk you through the tutorial, what will happen is some people will be waiting a long time for others to catch up. Some people will be behind and not be able to catch up. And I think this is going to work better. Anyway, so I actually don't have slides for most of this. I have slides in a few places, and I'll be putting them up as I need them. So let me just make sure I'm set here. Okay, yes. So first of all, why did I want to do a talk of giving you context and background? Well, there's two basic questions that I sort of want to answer, which is why do you need Pushkin, or why would somebody need Pushkin? And also, conversely, why doesn't it do everything for you? Because I'm going to show you and describe, there's still work here to be done in using Pushkin. So you shouldn't think of it as something like SPSS, or maybe even simpler than SPSS, something that just magically does your statistics for you. It's a bit more like R, right? So it is, hopefully extremely powerful, going to allow you to do a lot of things that you couldn't do on your own. But you are probably going to have to understand statistics, or in this case, a little bit of web development. But you're not going to need to program, everything from scratch. Just like in R, R means that you don't have to actually sit down and write out the linear algebra to do your statistics. Thankfully, because if we had to do that, it would take forever. Pushkin, I want to say, so I think we talked a lot about how JSPsych is fairly easy to use, even though it's very powerful. So undergraduates can get started in a couple days writing their own experiments. Pushkin's not that easy, but it is very doable, and I think more than worth it. So to actually put this in context, thinking about when I switched from actually doing my stats in Excel to using R, I just got to points where there were things that I wanted to do that literally could not be done in Excel, like mixed effects models. So I had to learn R. It took me a few weeks to learn, but at the end of that, I could do things that not only things I couldn't do in Excel, but things that I had been doing in Excel, but in like 10% of the time it had been taking me. And that is the hoped for experience with Pushkin. So a little bit of history. To sort of explain why Pushkin exists to begin with. I think that's going to be helpful for explaining why someone might need it. So in 2006, I was not yet a graduate student. I was a research assistant in Yuhong Jiang's lab at Harvard, and I went to an internal colloquium talk. And there was a postdoc by the name of David Feinberg, who's now at McMaster University, I believe, who was giving a talk about some research he was doing on the McGurk effect, I believe. But I noticed he didn't make a big deal of this, but as he was going through his slides, the N's were over 1,000 for some of these studies. So how do you get 1,000 subjects? And he said, I ran this online. How long did that take you to get 1,000 subjects? No, about a week. So he was I believe, postdoc in Mark Hauser's lab. Mark Hauser was getting a lot of press at that time for his book, Moral Minds. And I was driving a lot of traffic to their website, and they happen to have this experiment up there. And I remember thinking, what would I do if I had 1,000 subjects for a study? And I think, a lot of my career since then has been trying to answer that question. In week 2, I talked a lot about how one of the, back up a second. as I mentioned in week 2, the ability to collect a lot of data online has been around for a long time. As I mentioned this in 2006, when I learned about it, it was not even new. People have been doing this since the 80s. And 1,000 subjects is still a good number, right? Even though we do much larger studies now often. This is 2006, is a couple of years before Amazon Mechanical Turk existed, which of course raises the question, why isn't everybody running their studies online? Why haven't we already been doing that? And week 2, I talked at length about one of the major issues, I believe, is the need to think outside the box. Basically, the kinds of things that online studies allow you to do, the kinds of research questions that you can answer that weren't answerable before, are often ones that we just don't have a tradition of working on because they've just been impossible to research. There was no way to do interesting research on those questions, and so we often just don't think about them very much. And we don't have the paradigms, the experimental paradigms for exploiting the advantages of the internet. In fact, a lot of what how we're trained to do research is actually antithetical to running studies online. Not because running studies online, not because it's not antithetical because running studies online is bad or doesn't work or something, but it's just that the way that you need to do experiments in the laboratory is very different from the way you need to do them online. So that was one issue, and we talked about that in week 2. But I think that another obviously major issue is technical. So not only do you have to think outside the box, but also program outside the box. So 2006, again, I learned about the possibility to do online studies, and I was very fortunate that Yuhong let me largely work on what I wanted to as a research assistant. And so with her permission, I decided I was going to learn how to do some online experiments. First one I think that we were interested in was a single shot experiment. So single trials, so we needed a whole bunch of subjects for that. Anyway, back then it was really hard to figure out how to write a study for the web. So I got a copy of the moral sense test code from Ryan Boyko, who is a lab manager in Mark Hauser's lab, which was a survey, right? And try to turn that into a short-term memory experiment. Actually, no, in a visual attention experiment. And it wasn't easy to do, so I got a book on, 2 books actually, one on how to make email servers in PHP, and one to make video games in Flash, because Ryan Boyko's code used Flash. So this is obviously not an especially efficient way to learn how to run experiments online, but that was sort of what there was that I could find. And the original Games with Words was written entirely in Flash and PHP. In 2012, Flash was starting to, and I should say it took me about a month to learn the basic coding that I needed, and another week or 2 to make the first experiment. So the site was around for some years, but Flash started to die because of some vendetta that Steve Jobs had against Adobe. Also, truth be told, Steve Jobs' argument was that Flash was terrible, and it was kind of terrible writing experiments in Flash. So in 2012, I had the sort of rare occasion that I had an undergraduate who had a fair amount of web development experience. So I gave him the task of porting us over to something more modern, and he went for an entirely PHP and JavaScript-based site. And this, for people who know about web development, will know this was maybe a year or 2 before PHP also started dying. So he redid the site. I learned PHP from him. Again, that was a lot of time. We ran a bunch of new experiments, but PHP was dying by 2016. We ported over to React. In this case, I hired external web developers to help out with that. That worked about as well as has worked for most people who hire external web developers. I'm not sure how much of that code we use now or have ever used. But we did eventually make a React website. That's what Games with Words runs on now. Although it's had to be updated, we've had to update the code a few times because, again, web technology just keeps on developing. And so in 2018, 2019, I had a postbac who spent the bulk of her time re-implementing in more advanced versions of React and JavaScript. We had to move to the new version of JavaScript. And of course, the web servers that we use, we've had to switch a few times too. So is all this worth it? Absolutely, right? So I believe that I've done studies that I just could not have done in the laboratory, and I think made discoveries that would have taken literally an entire career. Otherwise, but was it efficient? Absolutely not, right? So I've spent a lot of my time in my career learning web development, which is not actually why I became a scientist. If I wanted to do web development, I'd do something else. And it's similarly in that it would be inefficient to do all of your statistics by reading the primary statistics literature and writing all your code from scratch in, say, Python or MATLAB. This is why R exists, or for simpler things, Excel or SPSS. Is also inefficient in another way, so I think so that inefficiency, I think, does explain why a lot of people haven't been doing online experiments, because you do have to put aside quite a lot of time to make your own site and be confident that you're going to get enough out of it, because obviously that's time that you're not spending doing research or writing papers or whatever. And there's an inefficient another way, which is at the same time I had other colleagues. So I started my site in 2006. I think some months before me, Laura Germain started Test My Brain, or rather the predecessor to Test My Brain, just as the thing I started in 2006 wasn't called Games with Words at the time. Folks like Project Implicit had been around for a while. And a few years later, Lab in the Wild came around, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a few different faceresearch.org had been around, and none of us were using the same code. It was actually very hard to share code because we were all doing things in somewhat different ways. Sharing code, for people who've tried doing it, know it's not easy to use somebody else's code. And this meant that all of us had to be reinventing the wheel quite a lot, right? So we'd spend time basically solving the same problems that somebody else had solved. And if I saw something, that I really liked that another site was doing, I had to figure out how to re-implement it from scratch. And this meant that none of us could do projects quite as ambitious as we would like to, because we're spending so much of our time doing basic things, solving the same basic problems that other people had already solved, but we just couldn't use their solution. So Pushkin really grew out of an attempt to both make it easier for my own research group to do our research, but also make it easier for us to share, basically share code and share work with other people who are doing similar research, and make it easier for people who don't want to spend months reading up on all the latest design trends in web development, which I think is actually all of us don't want to do that, but currently sort of have to, or historically you've had to. But let me get to, you may be wondering, why not just use JSPsych? And for that, I do have slides. Give me just a second. Screen. Because so you've already learned JSPsych, and you might wonder, well, why can't I just run my studies online like that? Doesn't that work pretty well? And it does. JSPsych, as I said, obviously I think it's a good idea. I wouldn't have been partnering with Josh and DeLay so much all this time if I didn't. But JSPsych writes your program. It writes the software. You use it to make the software to run your experiment. You still need a computer to run that program, right? A program by itself isn't going to do you any good. You need something to run it on, specifically a computer that is accessible by your subjects. You need a way of getting the data from your subjects, right, if they're not in the laboratory. And of course, you actually also need subjects. And we talked in week 2 about some ways that sort of volunteer online experiments do recruit subjects through, say, gamification, building mailing lists, a number of other strategies. And I want to point out that Amazon Mechanical Turk does these things for you. So if you do just say a simple survey in Amazon Mechanical Turk, you can actually use just their GUI. They will run everything on their web server for you. They have a button you can download your data, and they have a subject pool that you can pay to do your studies. This, as we talked about in week 2, is quite limited. So there's a lot of things you can't do in Amazon Mechanical Turk. But the point is that if you're not going to use Amazon Mechanical Turk, you have to solve all these problems yourself. And managing the web server, so the computer that your code runs on in the cloud, is really non-trivial. So dealing with updating the site can take quite a lot of time when you need to add new experiments. It doesn't have to, but you have to be clever about how you're doing it. Keeping up with bug fixes, dealing with scaling. So scaling is something that people do work with Amazon Mechanical Turk, and certainly from the laboratory, you don't worry about. But let's use the laboratory example, right? So typically, obviously nobody's testing subjects right now, but if you were, you might be testing maybe 5 at a time, right? If you have a lot of resources to test subjects. What if 100,000 subjects showed up tomorrow morning in your laboratory and wanted to be tested? Well, you wouldn't be able to test most of them, right? You have to send most of them away, and they may never come back. When you're on the web traffic really works that way. So, a typical day, these days right now, we haven't put up a new experiment in a while, so I think we're getting about 500 subjects a day to our website. More typical is more like 1,000 a day, but we'll have peaks of 100,000. And having a web server that can handle that much traffic all showing up at once is really non-trivial. And then, of course, as I went through this long story about how technology changes, just keeping your website up to date so it still runs on everybody's devices is also another issue. Something that I haven't mentioned is that I think this is true for Games with Words and true for a lot of other online laboratories, that we've only been slowly updating to really work well with mobile technology. Which again in 2006 was not an issue. So there's no iPhone. But now a large portion of all web traffic is on phones. And obviously a lot of things just don't work. So that's one of the things over the last couple of years that we've been handling. Stop the share again. So one more sort of topic before I get into sort of how Pushkin works is a little bit about the vision, what it was that we were trying to do with Pushkin. Because one of the things, in 2005 is when I started thinking about doing something like this. One of the things that I knew was that there had been many prior projects, all of which had fizzled. Right, so other people had tried coming up with systems that would allow people to easily run their experiments online with volunteers, not through Amazon Mechanical Turk. So in 2015, I did a listening tour. I talked to a lot of my colleagues, both who were running studies online and weren't, to try to understand what it was exactly that was required for people to actually use the software. And one of the things that became clear to me very soon is that our research is bespoke, right? So most people's experiments don't necessarily look exactly like anybody else's experiments a large portion of the time. Our job is literally to break new ground. And of course, that often involves doing something different than what anyone has done before. And so one size fits all software tends not to work very well. So what'll happen is you have some software, right, that can do certain kinds of experiments, but most of the people who want to use that software want to do an experiment that's just not supported by the software. So the advanced users will just write their own thing, which is what some of us have been doing. Whereas people who don't have the expertise or the time to write their own thing just won't use it. There's just not good economies of scale here. And I think this is really, you can see this in the example of, again, like R, right? So part of why R works is it does a lot of things, but often it doesn't do necessarily exactly what you might want to do. So you're going to have to write a little bit of code yourself. Um, it's not just plug and play. But you don't have to write too much, and it's a lot easier to use it than write something from scratch in MATLAB. And more advanced users who want to do something advanced will often just build a library for R that will do whatever their special case is that they can then share, and just like makes the ecosystem work better. There's more and more stuff that you can do. And there is this, these network effects. Actually, on the advice of specifically of Tim O'Donnell, I decided to try a very much an open source approach with an open source community, right? So try to build something that was not one size fits all, but like ours, something that would be, have enough there that it does 80% of what most people need, and that's enough for other people to build onto it as they need to. And that be a lot easier than doing things from scratch. And also enough that for a lot of users, to actually do 100% of what you need, right? So you won't not everybody will necessarily need to do anything new. And of course, as the community evolves and we have more tools as part of the system, then it'll be less and less necessary for anyone to do something from scratch. So that's actually where our name Pushkin comes from. So if people don't know, Alexander Pushkin is often regarded as the father of literary Russian. So when he started writing in Russian, Russian hadn't been used a lot for literature. It had been some for a few generations, but still, the aristocracy was just switching from speaking French to speaking Russian. And there just weren't, standard story paradigms. There wasn't a lot of words for things that you might want, allusions. There wasn't a lot to allude to. And he set about in a very conscious effort to build up the literary language of Russian, upon which, subsequent writers wrote their masterpieces. So as, a historical, pre-internet example of really like an open source project that lay the groundwork for later work. So how it works. And here I think I am going back to the slides. All of that background I think is necessary for you to understand why Pushkin is set up exactly the way it is, and understand what it does. So how it works. So one of the major things I think that we're doing for you is actually making a lot of core design decisions. So the thing about web development is that there are many, 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 many alternatives for anything that you might want to do. So to give you an example, you have to decide, for instance, do you want something that's JavaScript based, or are you going to do something Python based, or are you going to use Django, et cetera, et cetera. Even once you decided JavaScript, there's a whole lot of other options. So there's a few major JavaScript frameworks that people use that really speed up development of websites. When I was starting this in 2016, the major competitors were React, Angular, and Ember. I knew some folks who suggested that I should try Ember. And keep in mind, at this time, I didn't really know what a web framework was. I was told that it was probably something that I wanted to use, but I'd never used one before. I had just written JavaScript from scratch. So I was trying to figure out what it was, right? So I look up Ember, and it says, the documentation says it's a web framework. I'm like, okay, that's helpful. That's what I wanted to understand what exactly that was. Keep reading, and it says, one of the major things it does is help you use handlebars templates. Okay, so I looked up handlebars. Handlebars, what is that for? First thing you learned there, at least at the time, was this was basically a slight modification of mustache templates. So I have to go read, what mustache is. Point is, like, you had a number of choices anywhere along the way, and and just figuring out what your choices are, what exactly Ember and React and Angular do and why you might choose between them, requires an enormous amount of time. So I basically hired someone to do all that research for me. And that happens over and over and over in the process of building a website. And so I think that we have made some good decisions about which technologies we think are maybe not optimal. It's hard to know for sure what's optimal, but are pretty good choices for running an online experiment website. So you've done a lot of thought, so you don't have to. And one thing that you may just do if you are, advanced coder, is pay attention to our core design decisions and maybe not use a lot of our code. But we also have these core packages. They're called things like Pushkin Worker, Pushkin API, Pushkin Client. These are packages that have a lot of core utilities and functions that are very useful for putting together a website in general, and specifically for running online experiments. So you can think of this as sort of like the out-of-the-box R code and like built-in libraries that you don't have to download. It's a bunch of stuff that is useful, but if you want to do, your typical, analysis, you're probably going to need some sort of library on top of that. Although those libraries are going to be written in terms of this out-of-the-box code. So the other thing again, if you are a power user, you might start just with the core packages and build something yourself off of that to make something really custom for exactly what you want. But we also have these templates. So we have psych templates and experiment templates, and these you should think of as being kind of like our libraries. So these are not as flexible as just using the code, because again, it's impossible to build something that's one size fits all. They're designed for very specific purposes. Just like there's if you want to do linear mixed effects models in R, you use LME4 probably, or GLMER. And same idea is that we have these templates that you can use to do a number of things, but all around a theme. So as you'll see, we'll have like a self-paced reading experiment template, which will allow you to design not every kind of self-paced reading study you might want to do, but should, with relatively little work, allow you to run most kinds of self-paced reading experiments you might want to do. But we don't currently have one for priming. For instance, if you want to do a priming study, currently you probably wouldn't work within those templates. You would start, build your own or wait for somebody else to build one, as you do in, say, using R. And I think one of the, as you'll see in our roadmap, one of the major things that we're working on right now is building more of these templates. Yeah, and so they vary in customizability. You can make your own. The last thing that is part of the sort of Pushkin ecosystem right now, which is important, is the CLI, so command line interface. So these are a series of commands that you can write in the shell and terminal on a Mac that automate a lot of the work of putting together and managing a Pushkin website. This we learned was necessary the hard way. I'm trying to remember if who on this call was there. Josh DeLeo was there, maybe Parker. The very first Pushkin developer workshop we did, it took literally about 2 days to explain how to set up a Pushkin website. It had not been clear to us just how much work it was until that workshop, but it was quite clear by the end that that was way too long. It was way too long, way too hard. You had to know way too much. So the CLI, we're trying to automate as many things as possible, so that as you'll see when you go through the quick start, you can put together a very basic website with a few things, with just a few, typing a few commands. So it greatly simplifies installation and deployment. It's not required. Again, it doesn't do anything you can't do on your own in the terminal, but it's recommended to use the CLI because, again, it will be much, much, much faster. At the same time, again, the CLI doesn't automate everything, because automating everything is very hard. There will be some things you may want to do that's not in the CLI yet. We are continuing, as you will learn, to add more functions to that. And we'll certainly be guided by both what we ourselves need for our own research, but also what we hear people asking for. Okay, so yes, not required but recommended. So I want to talk a little bit about the roadmap for Pushkin. Some of you have probably heard about Pushkin since I started working with this in 2015, and are wondering exactly like where we are and how much is actually available, how much is still to come. So today we have one site template, we have 4 experiment templates, and the CLI will build your basic website locally, help you update it, and you can do local testing. It does not currently allow you to deploy to the web, but hopefully on Thursday, certainly on Thursday, barring another pandemic-related delay, things have been slowed down by the pandemic, as you might imagine. We'll have the CLI for AWS deploy. So right now, actually, that's not public, but in our private development branch, most of it is working right now. The big thing is a couple last pieces we need to put together, some security features I want to double check. I'm concerned about a couple security issues that I just want to make sure I've nailed down. And we need to make sure that it runs on that Windows and Unix users can use it. So like most things, Pushkin's developed in for a Mac. Works best on a Macintosh. Part of the delay, actually, the last 2 weeks in Nishinakonsai, was it was taking us a very long time to get Pushkin to run on Windows because of a bug in Linux for Windows that has not yet been solved by Windows, and so we needed to find an alternative method. I understand that currently you can use Pushkin. The Pushkin CLI specifically on Windows, or there is a method for doing so, which you Windows users will learn about. But obviously we need to test everything on multiple platforms, and the AWS deploy is not ready. In the fall, we're hoping to roll out a dashboard. So currently we are set up so that subjects can log in. Logging in doesn't do very much at the moment. I think it creates a static ID that they will continue to be given every time they log in, but I have not double checked that that's actually working. That's not been fully tested, basically. It was implemented. But the dashboard itself doesn't do anything, right? So like they don't get anything out of logging in, it just helps you, as opposed to them getting to like see, past results from past experiments or whatever. Okay, just making sure that's not somebody telling me that the internet's off or something. Okay, so dashboard is going to be implemented hopefully quite soon. A forum similar to what Zooniverse has. The key part of the forum here that we really wanted for sort of citizen science style projects, so less experiments, but things where the subjects are helping you code something. So we have this long going crowdsourcing linguistics project. And what we wanted people to be able to do is when they're trying to code an item is to be able to talk about it on the forum. And say, oh, I ran into this item, I'm not sure what to do about this, or isn't this funny? And then people can discuss it and then actually go from the forum back and code that item. And that going back from the forum to coding the item is actually technically more difficult than you might think. This has, again, it's been implemented in, so-called Pushkin version 0, not the one that is currently public. And we're just trying to make sure that it works with the new CLI code. Basically, we had to make some changes to the way Pushkin is set up to make the CLI work. So again, this is why you probably wouldn't use it for an experiment, but I think that something Zooniverse has shown is they've made some actual major discoveries from participants looking at one of their items and saying, huh, isn't that funny? And discovering entire new phenomena that way. Feedback templates. So as we talked about in week 2, a big part of recruiting subjects for volunteer experiments is making it meaningful for the participants. one of the ways to make it meaningful is for them to learn something about themselves from it. Setting that up is not super hard, but not trivial. We have, again, some templates already set up that aren't sufficiently well tested to be publicly available. And then also doing things like mailing lists. So if you go to Games with Words, you'll see that you can sign up not just for our mailing list in general, but for getting learning about the results of only one specific experiment. So this is a way of letting people sort of fulfilling our IRB duty of informing people when results of an experiment they participated in are available, but not spamming them with stuff that they don't know. So emailing everybody every time there's an update. And setting that up and having it automated is, again, one of those things not super hard, but it's a decent amount of work for someone who knows some development, and something that we want to just basically automate setting that up through the CLI. And we're going to try to improve the AWS deploy, which I'll get back to in a second, explain what that's about. In the new year, the major thing that I know that's coming up is right now, we had to basically fork JSPsych. We have a slightly different version of JSPsych that Pushkin uses because of the difference in how JavaScript in a web browser as opposed to JavaScript on a Node backend works. The changes that we've made are getting ported into the next release of JSPsych, which is planned for early next year. This is not something that should affect users a great deal, but is a non-trivial amount of time. So I mentioned like that's something that we're working on. Now, this timeline, of course, is obviously, there's some unknowns here. Things could be slowed down by, for instance, a pandemic, which has been happening. But there's also ways that it may accelerate. One is contributors. As I said, this is an open source project. The way open source projects work when they're successful is lots of different people contribute. We have a few people have contributed to Pushkin already. If a few power users decide to make their own new experiment template, we will get more experiment templates faster. So Jordan Sasha, for instance, has said that he plans on writing a plugin for the CLI to do deployment on Heroku instead of Amazon Web Services. For instance, we'll get new features that way, hopefully, as people contribute. The other thing that I'm just going to mention is subcontracts, which is one of the options you may consider, and people have done this in the past, is partnering with my group. If you have a project where you want to do a massive online study, but it requires features that Pushkin doesn't yet have, if we could put together the funding to basically hire assistant developers, things go a lot faster. So right now, for instance, Connie Bainbridge is at the lab for just a short contract before heading on to graduate school, as funded through this workshop, and things are going so much faster because she's here. Parker Robbins also is partly funded through this workshop and has joined the lab for a bit. When we have funds to basically add more developers besides me, things obviously go faster. Instantly, though, also, I am not writing more, not going to try to write grants to fund the development itself. I've worked out that it is much more efficient for me to spend time writing code than writing the infrastructure grants. Also, I guess I've never gotten one funded, whereas we get research grants that have a programming subcomponent funded much more often. So I actually hopefully will speed things up. I worked out I spent about 500 hours writing Pushkin grants and haven't gotten any, and 500 hours spent on coding will speed things up. I'm saying this mainly for people who have been wondering why Pushkin hasn't come along faster than it has. People have been hearing about it for a few years. I was writing grants, now I'm writing code, and it is going much faster. Other unknown I don't know why this is getting repeated. Okay, so today, and then we're going to do a Q&A. So today, you should go to our documentation, which is online. Again, I think it's going to be much more efficient for you to go through it yourself. and ask questions than to watch me go through it and try to follow along. I am hoping that we're not going to run into a lot of issues, but because we've tested this on a few different platforms, but there are many more platforms out there than what we've been able to test. And obviously the documentation is new, so you may run into questions that just aren't answered there. So I think this is going to be much more efficient. The sections you should go through are installing Pushkin dependencies, the quick start, I recommend reading about the Pushkin CLI itself, the documentation on that, and using experiment templates and trying out those experiment templates, particularly if you are interested in a lexical decision task or self-paced reading or grammaticality judgment, which are the three major templates. We also have one called Basic, which is really boring. All it does is say hello world and not record any data. So you can try that one out, but it's really just for testing. You can do what's in the documentation on deploying to Amazon Web Services. There's mostly a lot of preliminary stuff you need to do there, a few accounts that you need to create that we can't do just automatically. And it won't actually push anything to AWS yet, but they may want to get started on those things. Oh, and I remember what was missing. So I want to say a little bit about, I definitely wrote that. I want to say something, let me just make sure this slide is, yeah, I definitely wrote the section on cost. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about cost. Oh yeah, you can ask questions here. The Pushkin Consortium discussion board. And so we should put them. We will, for more complicated things, potentially hop on Zoom calls with individuals or small groups during the, up through 3:30 today. On Thursday, we're going to reconvene at the normal 1 to 4 time. We're going to, for deploying AWS, make sure you have an Amazon Web Services account. Before then, it can take a little while for those to get activated. And if you sign up right at the beginning on Thursday at 1 o'clock, you may not have an activated account even by 4. The cost for doing the trial deploy is around $15. That's not money you need to give us. That is money that goes to Amazon Web Services. Specifically, you're going to want to register a domain name, a URL. That's most of the cost, and then very small amount of money for whatever services that you through AWS that you use. You can follow along some stuff without that. Actually, just the stuff that is up on the list today. Most of the stuff that we will be adding for the CLI commands, you would need to have bought a domain name, I believe. No, you can use, well, you can read in the instructions. You can buy domain names not through Amazon Web Services. It's just more complicated to do that. And then, so on Thursday, I'll do a short overview of how the deploy works. And then same thing as today, try it at your own speed. We will be available to answer questions and help deal with bugs if there are any, which hopefully there won't be. But, potentially deal with things that, weren't, questions you have that aren't covered in the documentation yet. Beyond that, I did want to say something about how much it costs to run a website using Pushkin. This is variable partly based on your the amount of traffic. I will say that Games with Words currently runs about $400 a month, but it's variable. Most of that goes into the database, or not most of it, probably about half of it is just paying for the database, because I pay for a lot of extra security for the database, because I've had databases crash and get corrupted before. And I'm personally careful about that. I believe the Music Lab, the musiclab.org, which uses, say, Pushkin version 0, like Games with Words, I think they pay a bit less. It's more on the order of like $200 a month, because theirs is a bit more optimized. They have a newer version, basically, of our deploy setup. I think it can be optimized more and be made, maybe even half that price. That is when I said we're going to be working on a better AWS deploy in the fall. That's something that we're working on. The reason that it hasn't already been done is the amount of money that we'll save, which is a couple $100 a month maybe. If you compare that to the cost of developer time, it actually just doesn't work out to be efficient for an individual lab. As more labs are using Pushkin, then at least across everybody, it eventually makes sense to spend that time, which is why we'll do that. Also, I want to update to do some things that'll run a little bit faster with newer AWS features. And that, I believe, is it. And we are ready for questions. So ready for live questions right now, as opposed to the, so it'd be like overview questions. If you have specific coding questions, you should probably ask those in the forum. Also, I will point out, if you don't want to write down the information on the slide, you can back up YouTube recordings. So you can just back up and pause on this page if you need it later. Okay, so Connie, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. So first off, is there anywhere in the Pushkin docs where people can find an overview of the different technologies and kind of a brief explanation of what they're used for? Which I think I can answer, I guess, because I've been working on the docs.
Yes, documentation.
Don't exactly. We do sometimes explain a little bit, just a quick blurb about something as it's in the docs as far as like installing something, but we would be happy to add in maybe an overview page that might be helpful.
Yeah, or maybe in the FAQ. You started an FAQ, right?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, if you can, Connie, or actually Megan, since you're listening, Megan, if you can go add an issue in the Pushkin documentation, then we will be sure to do that, because it's a good idea. All right, more questions.
Yes, so can you please elaborate on the specific relation between JSPsych and Pushkin? Are there Pushkin templates written in JSPsych?
Oh, that's a good question. I meant to say that, but I didn't have it in my notes, so I didn't. Yes, so out of the box, so remember back when I was talking about the difference between templates and the core code. The core code is essentially agnostic. You could use JSPsych, you could use certainly anything else JavaScript based to write your experiments in, but our templates we've been writing entirely using JSPsych, just because, again, I think it's particularly easy to use and powerful. So if you're using any templates, that'll assume that you're writing your experiments in JSPsych. And just to highlight, for instance, the main reason that you would use the basic experiment template is the basic experiment template basically has an empty file that you can just drop a JSPsych timeline into. And at that point, it should run, basically. So we did like write these templates around the assumption that people use JSPsych. And that's what our documentation is for. But again, if people decide they want to use Psycho.js or something else, I don't know if that's something that we're going to put a lot of effort into supporting, but it's certainly something that people could very easily develop. I think something that we are talking about is potentially doing some sort of integration with Dallinger to help people do some of the sort of iterated learning experiments, for instance. And that would actually run through a different part of the system, which is the workers, probably. Okay, other questions?
Yeah. How easy will it be to update Pushkin as new major features roll out? Is there any reason to delay installing until deployment is available through the CLI, for example?
So I would, since I have been in the midst of writing the CLI for the last couple of weeks, my current intention, and I really am trying to stick to this, is that there will be no breaking changes when Pushkin AWS init finally becomes live. Right, so that's the command for initializing an AWS site. So there, you shouldn't need, so I don't think there's a worry about having installed an old version of the site template. As far as the CLI, you will need to update the CLI, but that is on Thursday, but that is a matter of like typing 4 words. So I wouldn't worry about that. In general, over time, we will have breaking changes, I'm sure. So breaking changes where, like, new version of the CLI just won't run with a particular, site template. But the nice thing about using package managers is you can continue using old versions indefinitely. The main thing that you'll run into is eventually just like the web changes and technology won't work, and you'll need to update. My hope is that we will be writing sort of migration code. One thing that we definitely have done is try to, as much as possible in the site template that we've made, and experiment templates, is silo custom code from anything that's Pushkin specific. So most of the customization that you might do is going to be in a small number of files that you will be able to just basically, like, you could make a new Pushkin site on your computer and just copy over those files. That's probably how most updates for the short term are going to work. That, of course, as I've pointed out before, we've changed technologies twice now from ActionScript to PHP to React. And React is going to eventually die too, and we'll have to move on to something new. That's just like the nature of the web. But we'll certainly be, writing migration guides for that, because if nothing else, it's going to affect, me, and that we're going to need to port over our work over to. As far as delaying, though, I think, with any sort of continuously released software, there's always going to be, new updates later. And that's not going to change, right? We'll hopefully continue adding things. I think we are at the point, though, that you can do quite a lot with what we have, and it makes sense to be using it as it is now, or as it is Thursday, since right now, as I said, we have instructions on how to deploy to AWS by hand. Again, they're pages long. I would recommend waiting for Thursday when the CLI deploy is hopefully done.
All right. So another question is, so is everything that you can do for Pushkin in the command line or in the terminal window? And also, what is the SQL manager going to be used for Postgres?
Okay, second one first. SQL is for connecting to your database. So something that I have not written for Pushkin, and I don't know that we will anytime soon for the CLI, is an automatic download of your data. So for that, you would want to connect to your database using a database manager. And that allows you to view your data. That's the other thing, is that if you don't want to download, you just want to look at the data. Writing something custom for that would be a lot of work when there's perfectly good programs out there that you can use. So that's what that is. It's just connecting to the database, looking at your data, and downloading it. So just like usually just like a button for downloading from a particular table. It also, though, if you wanted to edit, well, I do not recommend editing any of your tables by hand, but you simply because we use this migration system for updating, for like managing the database. But you could use a SQL manager for that. I think it's not so. I think the answer to the first question is complicated. So really, again, it depends a lot on what you want to do, right? So basically, the major kinds of things you need to do when putting together a site is manage your web server. In this case, again, we're recommending Amazon Web Services, which is the industry default. their documentation is hundreds of pages long. They have many, many dozens of services. Obviously, what we've automated through the CLI is a small fraction of what can be done. Now, what we've automated is the stuff that we think is most crucial. But it doesn't mean that you're never going to run into something that you actually want to adjust by hand, which you can do again through AWS. And they have their own documentation, and they have a GUI. They also have their own CLI. What our CLI is doing is actually sending a whole lot of commands to the AWS CLI. The other thing, so you might want to do stuff through AWS directly. As I mentioned for tables, so we are sort of by default doing very, very simple database tables. You might, depending on what exactly it is that you want to do with your experiments, you might come up with a case where you want more complex database tables. And you would need to write your own connects migrations, they are called. So use connects for managing the database. Connects has its own documentation. It's relatively straightforward if you already know SQL. Otherwise, you need to learn SQL. We're getting back to this never-ending chain of programs depending on programs depending on programs. The point of the CLI is to abstract away as much as possible of that. But what percentage of what you need is actually abstracted away is going to really depend a lot on what it is exactly you're trying to do. The other big one is actually modifying the layout of your website. So we have for the one site template that exists, there's a few things you can do sort of fairly easily, like change some logos and change the list of people. So we have a people page, like an about page, and a findings page where you can list findings from previous studies. And that's fairly straightforward to modify without having to know anything about web development. But if you wanted to do things like add additional pages, right? So you want a page for, I don't know, photos you took on your summer vacation for whatever reason. Again, I think we've put in a lot of the pages that you probably need, but what I'm going to think you need is going to depend on part based on what kinds of studies I'm used to doing. If you want to add new pages or really fundamentally change the layout, you should hire someone like Connie to work for a couple years to do that. That was, in fact, a lot of Connie's job at the Music Lab, I believe. Is that right, Connie?
Yeah, definitely a part of it.
Part of it. Anyway, and that's something that, again, if you want to do that, you should learn basically React is the technology we use for that. And you would edit that in your favorite web editor, which was talked about during week 1 when you're using JSPsych. Okay, we should probably not only take 1 or 2 more questions, but do we have any more?
Sure. So this question is for people trying to decide what platform to use. How does Pushkin compare to Pavlovia? And people are also interested in how it compares to PCI-BEX. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it.
PCI-BEX, yeah. Okay, so PCI-BEX, all right, I think that I did an okay job of this in the online promo that was emailed around, but to try to recap that a little bit, I think that if you want a research website along the lines of Games with Words or Lab in the Wild or the Music Lab or Project Implicit or any of those, there are no other options currently. So Pavlovia will host an individual experiment. They don't give you a site, right? Same with PCI-BEX doesn't even do that. I believe, actually, someone else may know what I want to say about this, but I believe that they're helping you set up your web server, but you're still going to need to actually have a web server. Oh, you can use IBEX Farm, I guess. So IBEX Farm, again, will help you host an individual experiment. None of the, they're not meant to have like a freestanding website. None of them, I think, are going to do particularly well with scaling, is my guess, because I don't think any of them have had to deal with scaling. If you're using Amazon Web Service, Amazon Mechanical Turk, generally you don't get these 100,000 subjects all of a sudden. And I'm not going to give you, some of these other like gamification elements or things that I think that we really care about. We being like the Pushkin team. It's probably not entirely fair to say this, but I think of most of the other systems about, they're either competitors to JSPsych and that they're about writing your software but don't handle deploying it online. Or they handle deploying an individual experiment meant to be used in conjunction with Amazon Mechanical Turk or Prolific. One obvious counterexample or semi-counterexample might be something like Volunteer Science, which is like Zooniverse and its own freestanding website that will host individual experiments for you as for volunteers to participate in. Again, I think like if you want to do anything that goes sort of outside of the what they can support with the individual experiment, it's not going to be particularly customizable. So I don't really see any of those as alternatives. I think that they do fundamentally different things. Do we have one more?
Yeah, so can you comment on participant recruitment efforts related to running your own website?
Yeah, so I will say, so my experience after, I guess, 14 years now is that content is king. There's nothing you can do that is better than having a fun experiment that people want to do. And people have tried putting out Facebook ads. You can get a few people that way. You can spend a lot of time emailing people. You can try to get a lot of media attention, which is something I did early on. I discovered that it was much better to you can work very, very hard to get a reporter to write about your experiment, and that will send a bunch of traffic, but generally they won't do it if it's not an interesting experiment, because they're not interested in writing about something boring. If you make something really interesting, they'll write about it without you even having to talk to them. So this is where sort of the gamification, like the feedback templates, and also just having like a fairly usable design, usable user interface, I think is really crucial and where we put a lot of our effort. Having a mailing list is helpful in that, so our mailing list for Games with Words is I think about 4,000 subjects right now. So when we put up a new experiment, we can, I mean, you get like 1% response rate to mailing lists, but that means we have like 400 people come see the experiment. And if they like it, then share it on social media. So that's something else that we do and is implemented, is making it easy for people to post an experiment to social media. And that sort of word of mouth seems to be more important than anything else. And again, that happens if you have something interesting, which is where I think, again, also Pushkin ultimately, right now, the differences are not huge, but in terms of our, our long-term plans or medium-term plans, that's really a focus of what we're doing. I think is not a focus of any of the systems that are really intended for use with Amazon Mechanical Turk, because since you're paying people to participate in your study, you just don't have to worry about if it's interesting or fun. So, okay, people have more questions about, so people have more high-level questions about sort of running online experiments, or why you might use this platform as opposed to that platform, what differences are. Those go to, this is not on the screen, but it is on the website for Moving Science Online. Go to the forum we used during week 2, the online experiments forum. That's for general discussion of online experiments. People have specific, technical questions. How does this work? How does that work? I'm having a problem with this, et cetera. How do I do this? How do I do that? Specific to Pushkin, should go to our Pushkin discussion forum, which is on this slide. And we will be over there monitoring those questions until for the next hour and a half, basically. And then we will be back on Thursday. So I hope this goes well. I'm nervous. This is by far the biggest number of people who have tried using anything that I've written before. So we've done a lot of testing. I'm optimistic, but I'm really excited for you to all try it out. We are super motivated to handle issues and bugs. So, post issues as you have them, because we really want to, I think this is, a great time for people to be moving research online. This is not something that I want to hoard for myself, and that there's so many good experiments that can be run right now. My group can run a tiny fraction of them. I want to see good science happen. I really want this to work out. So, so please, if you do run into issues, don't get discouraged. We will work with you, and I will see you shortly over in the forum.